we can go straight into David Johnston, who has done all kinds of neat things that he can talk about. He sponsored a hackathon, which I think is $1 million prize, I believe. Is that right, David? Yeah. He sponsored a hackathon where he let people design stuff, and the hackers. And by the way, for those of you who don't know, hackathon, it's just a term used. They're not necessarily trying to like break into something. They're trying to make something better. So it's basically intense computer programming, little teams. And so he sponsored a $1 million prize for that. He's involved with all kinds of neat stuff, really smart in the space, somebody I respect a lot. I don't know how he has the time to do what he does, because I don't know, I don't have the time to do what I do, and he does everything I do and quite a bit more. So I'm really excited to have him here. Here's David. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bruce. All right, everybody. Good morning. I had the pleasure of meeting a lot of you last night, and that was a lot of fun. Good to catch up with friends. These conferences almost feel like really good family reunions where you see people that you talk to for a while over the internet, but here you get to see them in person. So good stuff. But I'll just go ahead and, if technology cooperates, jump right into the presentation. All right. Cool. So I actually want to talk about the long-term trend today, about how I see decentralization as sort of this general march of humanity over the centuries. And I'm going to talk about a couple of historical examples. But as Bruce mentioned, this is sort of what I'm known for is Johnston's Law. I put this out at the San Francisco conference earlier this year, and basically said, I really think this just boils down to everything that can be decentralized will be decentralized. And so I see that trend really playing out in a lot of different ways. So we can look at historical examples. For example, the storage of information. Historically, when information was extremely expensive to record, you had something like the Library of Alexandria, where we aggregated huge amounts of human knowledge in one place. Unfortunately, every couple hundred years, Library of Alexandria burns down, a lot of humanity's knowledge is lost, and we're all set back, right? It really wasn't until the advent of the printing press that you had the ability to produce and reproduce information cheaply enough that we have the abundance of information that we're used to today. Situations where everybody's used to having a public library on the corner or a personal library in their home, and it created a situation where information was far less fragile. Everybody had a copy of all of these different books, and so instead of losing centuries of history, now all of these copies of information were preserved over time. And that really accelerated technology and innovation and invention. When you have a solid record of what people have done before, you can really build quickly in the future. So we've also seen a huge decentralization when it comes to economics. You have to think about this historically. For most of human history, the king decided and would give a monopoly on the production of almost every good and service. And this, in fact, was formalized in most of Europe. The king would actually hand out monopolies on sugar and wheel production and cart production and coffee production. There would be a monopoly in one provider of every particular good and service. Obviously, that wasn't very efficient. And finally, in the United Kingdom in 1624, they passed the Statute of Monopolies, which for the first time got rid of the king's power to grant monopolies. At the time, he was granting perpetual monopolies on these goods and services, and it vastly limited that power and said, okay, you can only give out monopolies to new inventions, and you can only do it for 14 years, none of this perpetual stuff. And essentially built what we think of as the modern patent system today. And I would argue that it's not by accident that their society, which adopted this much more competitive creation of goods and services, quickly led to the Industrial Revolution. It really set the groundwork for a situation where you had lots of competition and people making economic decisions in those productions. So, which quickly led to this huge explosion in the production of GDP. Shortly after the Industrial Revolution, we see these lines that have pretty much been horizontal for a very long time as far as growth and prosperity begin to really take off. And we're used to now the abundance that we see around us. I mean, virtually everything in this room was produced by private enterprise, from the bottles you're drinking, to the chairs you're sitting on, to the clothes you're wearing. We take it for granted now that everything is produced in this decentralized way where somebody came up with an idea for some product or service and just went and built it. They didn't need a permission of a monopoly in order to accomplish it. So we've now entered this globalized system where all these countries and jurisdictions even are competing with each other. And so this globalization has led to these great things that we appreciate today. But this is the famous picture of the internet. We're now seeing the modern reincarnation of the printing press in the new decentralization of information. Just as the printing press gave us more copies of things more cheaply, the internet obviously has done that for all of us today at a massive level we've never seen before. So we've had this explosion of social media, of tons of ways the individual can express themselves. Everyone has a computer in their pocket. And so it's a wonderful world, but one thing hasn't caught up to this internet-powered world we live in, and that is there's still a big monopoly out there. And it's an economic monopoly and it's a monetary monopoly around the choice of what the interest rate is going to be, around how many units of money are going to be in the system. And we know this as central banking today, right? It's one of the few large monopolies that really still affects a huge swath of human enterprise. And there's some downsides to centralization. When the Greenspans of the world leave the interest rate too low, too long, all of a sudden you get housing bubbles and malinvestment, and there's too much currency in the system, and the interest rates are too low, and so there's no alignment. And you get 2008, right? The housing bubble unwinds, the derivative bubble unwinds. We have this sort of cascading problem. And I think of Bitcoin as largely a reaction to the crisis in 2008. Obviously, we know from Satoshi that was one of his original inspirations. And so Bitcoin is to the internet what is information. Bitcoin is to finance and monetary. And I wanted to walk through briefly, especially for those that are new to the industry, sort of a little bit of the history of how we got to where we are today with Bitcoin. So it started in 2008 with Satoshi's white paper proposing this incredible invention to establish consensus among distributed nodes in this ledger system. In 2009, Satoshi released the first client and basically gave people some real code and real software that they could work with and play with. And it grew very slowly at first. It wasn't really until 2010 that we saw some of the first real-world transactions. This is the famous $1 million pizza. This is widely recognized as the first real-world Bitcoin transaction. A gentleman in Florida and a gentleman in the United Kingdom traded 10,000 Bitcoins in exchange for these two pizzas, which the gentleman in London called up the Pizza Hut, gave them his credit card number, paid for the pizza. They were delivered to the gentleman in Florida. The gentleman in Florida gave him the 10,000 Bitcoins, which of course at $300 a Bitcoin plus, those are $3 million pizzas now. So, and the story goes that the guy in London kept the Bitcoin, so good for him. But that's widely regarded as one of the first transactions. But it really changed people's idea about Bitcoin that, oh, this is something we can use for real-world transactions. In 2011, we really saw the emergence of the first exchanges, people really setting a higher and higher price for Bitcoin. Obviously, it had started at almost nothing and began to go to $1, a few dollars, began breaking sort of psychological barriers. In 2012, we saw the emergence of projects and services like BitPay that were solely focused on providing merchant services. So as Bruce and the other speaker were mentioning earlier, what you want to get around is the complexity of Bitcoin. Each merchant doesn't have to understand the details and the inner workings of the blockchain. And in fact, they don't want to take simple things like currency risk. They just want to be able to take the Bitcoins and turn them into dollars. And largely, that's what Bitcoin and BitPay has done for these providers, is give them a very simple way to accept the currency and they can convert whatever portion they want back into fiat or keep some of it in Bitcoin. So that's been really advantageous and really set off sort of a lot of the broader adoption of merchant services. In 2013, people started really realizing, wow, Bitcoin's more than a currency. We can use this cryptographic ledger to issue smart properties and other tokens and all sorts of metadata that we can attach to these transactions. And so the Master Protocol was one of the very first projects to say, okay, let's build a protocol on top of Bitcoin that will allow people to create these smart properties and build these assets. So they launched in August of 2013, and that really set off this chain reaction of other people imagining what they could do with this blockchain technology. In fact, it got me thinking that Bitcoin in general really represents a new way of doing technology development. I mean, it's really amazing that we're sitting here talking about a project that's worth $5 billion in market cap, and it has no CEO. It has no sales force. It has no payroll, and it has none of the traditional structures we think about. But what I realized is there's really 4 things that set Bitcoin apart. And the first is the fact that it was open source. If it had been proprietary, there would have been a lot of hurdles for people adopting it. But since it was open source, it was really easy for people to build on top of it. But more importantly, because it had its own token, it had a means for incentivizing people to secure the network. It really was the first, I think about it as the first self-monetizing type of open source. And so by having a coin associated with adding value to the network, all of a sudden you could reward people for behaviors, right? The third thing is the fact that all of the information storage was decentralized. There was no central point of failure. Every node had a copy of all the transactions. It really created a situation where there was no possibility of a bottleneck or Amazon Web Services go down and the service goes out, right? It was really anti-fragile and could operate globally and perpetually. And the fourth aspect I think about is the fact that the consensus mechanism, the proof of work algorithm that Bitcoin uses, was a really genius way to reward people and to cryptographically prove that people should be rewarded as miners and nodes for the work that they were doing. So that cut out any need for a bureaucracy or a management layer or a CEO or somebody deciding who got paid. The network itself decided who got that incentive. And so by open sourcing it, by attaching a token, by making it fully peer-to-peer, by having a consensus mechanism, that I think is the 4 characteristics that have really driven the success of Bitcoin. But I thought to myself, there's no reason this model can't be replicated for things that aren't currency, for things that aren't payment networks. There's nothing magical about that use case that makes it singular and an exception. I think this is a technology, method of developing technology that we can use for all sorts of things. And so I wrote this white paper at the end of 2013 about decentralized applications and got people thinking about that whole idea. And since then, we've seen this explosion of other projects, dozens now, the Safe Network, the Storage Network, Ethereum, using this model of open source, a token, a consensus mechanism, and fully peer-to-peer infrastructure. So it's been a really amazing year as people have built these different protocols. The Safe Network does decentralized storage. Storage Network is very much like a decentralized Dropbox. Ethereum I think about as distributed compute. You're paying for somebody to run a script or run an application. So almost like a decentralized Amazon Web Services. So it's really exciting to see people building these really low-level protocols that are beginning to spark other people's imagination, what they can build on top of that. So lastly, I want to talk about this year coming and really the challenges that are left for the blockchain. A lot of them are around scaling the technology. And I actually think these are probably the 2 most important projects when it comes to scaling the blockchain. So the first, sidechains, is a proposal in a white paper right now for building out ways to transfer tokens from one chain to another chain, but importantly, to do it with no third party, to do the trades atomically and to do them without a counterparty. So these are known as atomic trades from one sidechain to another. That's really going to open up things where you can really experiment with Bitcoin in lots of new ways or run chains that have different characteristics, different confirmation times, things like that. So I think that's going to be really important. Be exciting to see that technology roll out. The second is Factum, and Paul's going to talk about this later today, but the idea that you can build a data layer on top of the blockchain and attach huge amounts of information with just a single transaction, with just a single hash. Their technology lets you store hundreds, thousands, even millions of documents and attach them to the blockchain using what they call a proof of audit system, a proof of process, proof of existence system. So those are the kind of solutions we need to solve issues around bloat, where if everybody has to store all of the transactions, you don't want the record of the transactions getting too large. It solves such limitations around speed. Right now we're waiting for 10-minute transactions. This gets you into a situation where you can do real-time transactions, and it solves limitations around cost. Now, we can all be really excited that Bitcoin, I can send $1 million for half a penny. But if you're Zynga and you want to do 100 million transactions a day, half a penny adds up, right? And so they looked at, earlier this year, using the blockchain for their tokens and decided it wasn't ready yet because the cost and the transaction times would be too long. But I think these two technologies are really going to take us from 56K modems, if you will, to extremely fast internet, if I can use that analogy for the blockchain. So anyway, that's sort of the journey we've been on, I think, as humanity, specifically in this industry. And I think the result is that in the future, we're going to take for granted that monetary decisions, financial decisions, and really all economic activity, for the most part, is going to be driven by these decentralized systems. I see this as an entirely new asset class. It's an entirely new and novel type of technology method that is largely going to supplant corporate and other methods of building technology. So anyway, that's my grand vision for the world and why I'm so excited about all this. My day job is I run the Decentralized Applications Fund. We're the first venture capital group in the world to only invest in Bitcoin 2.0 technologies. So Ethereum, MadeSafe, Swarm, storage. If you've heard of a lot of these 2.0 projects, we're probably involved in helping them write their white papers, doing due diligence, working with the different projects to help them find developers and really accelerate what they're doing. So if you're interested in that type of technology, definitely corner me afterwards and tell me what you're working on. We'd love to see things really early on. And with that, I'll just open it up to questions. Thank you. All right, who's got the first one? I think we have a microphone too.
If nobody has the first question, we'll skip the first one. We'll go right to the second. We'll go to the second.
Can you talk about how decentralized applications might or necessarily leads to decentralized opportunities, opportunities for investment, fairness in investment, et cetera?
Sure. This is one of the things that gets me really excited about Bitcoin and blockchain technology in general, is there aren't any gatekeepers. So a lot of us grew up in a world where we had to apply to get a job. Nobody has to apply to mine Bitcoin. They can just show up with the right hardware and begin working. And I think we're doing things that are quantifiable right now. Mining is quantifiable as how much hash power have I provided. But we're getting to a point where people are figuring out other things that we can quantify. So for example, the Safe Network has come up with a cool mechanism to quantify adding storage to a distributed network. So now I can show up with hard drives and get compensated for adding my hard drive space to the Safe Network. Or storage is doing something very similar. Ethereum is rewarding me for running scripts. I think we're going to end up with a huge number of cryptographic proofs that build on each other, and we're proving ever more complex things. Like, I'm really excited about what the guys at Ribbit are doing. They're doing a proof of commerce, but that required Bitcoin to exist. It required other technologies to exist. So I think as we build these low-level protocols that define different value propositions and build a consensus mechanism around different types of value, we'll be able to do ever more complex things till we're quantifying very high-level things that we couldn't imagine using a cryptographic mechanism for to today. So, but to answer your question, that's a really cool world where I can just show up and I don't need permission. There is no gatekeeper. It's an entirely democratic and flat type of organization where I can show up. I didn't ask anybody's permission to join the Bitcoin industry, right? There was no company to ask. I just showed up and started doing what I thought would benefit Bitcoin. But yeah, that gets me really excited. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have a question about your law.
Sure.
As I understand it, paraphrasing, you say anything that can be decentralized will be decentralized.
Right.
So my question is, do you have any insight into what things can be and what things can't be? Are there things that fundamentally cannot be decentralized?
So I think the evidence so far is that these decentralized systems, at least right now, are best when it's a large platform where the network effect is really powerful and the switching costs are high. So that's kind of why I'm pointing out these low-level protocols is, it's a really big platform to build decentralized storage, right? You can build innumerable applications on top of that. So that's a really low-level protocol that seems sort of straightforward that you can build the consensus mechanism. It's a large enough use case where people are going to build a network effect on top of it, and the switching costs are fairly high. So I think that's probably the prototypical case. Now, if you're doing some niche library that's going to serve 5 people and has no network effect and has very low switching costs, I think that's going to be tough to figure out how you build a decentralized system around that, especially if it's the type of thing where it's a fairly small amount of work to build the protocol. It's not something like, the guys that built the Safe Network have spent 7 years figuring out how to fully remove server architecture and supplant it with a peer-to-peer storage consensus mechanism. It hasn't been easy. And they've built a huge amount of code, and the learning curve is really high, and you have to go up it and really understand how the technology works. So, I think what's first going to be decentralized are low-level infrastructure, and I think we'll sort of push the bounds with every new layer of technology. A couple of years ago, people would have laughed, proof of commerce. Like, yeah, now I can imagine how you can do that. But you needed all these other technologies to exist first. So I think we'll keep pushing the bounds project by project, and people will say, well, can we do, one I'm really excited about is proof of bandwidth. So using a mesh network and incentivizing people to add a node and relay information from one device to another could supplant ISPs. But the technology is really tough. I've looked at a bunch of the white papers. You get into high-level mathematics like eigenspeed, and just how can you measure one node making relay of information to another node? Can the node only measure ones that's slower than itself or faster than itself? And so there's going to be a lot of heavy lifting with the cryptography, and we'll kind of push the bounds each time and see how far we can push it. Yes, sir.
So 12 months from now, when you have the 2015 slide up,
Yep.
what is the one-sentence tagline? Oh, beautiful. So then, do you have any elaborations on the next 12 months and how that's going to be accomplished?
So I think these two protocols are really important this year because a lot of the other things I would want to build on a blockchain require these two to exist. So sidechains, for example, gives me interoperability of moving coin value from one chain to another. Right now, we don't have that. But the reason that's important is, well, the criticism they often put out there is, well, people don't want to work with 1,000 different coins. They're not going to be able to keep track of all of them. But as soon as you have interoperability, you can make the user interface much simpler. You can do all of the token transfers in the background. It'll happen programmatically. It'll happen automatically. Right now, where you have to have a counterparty, when you move from one, you need an exchange, right? You need something where somebody is holding both coins. When we change that architecture and make it completely peer-to-peer, that'll open up a whole new set of applications that we can make interoperable. With Factom, I think the byline is a data layer for the blockchain. And being able to take huge amounts of data and secure it to the blockchain will be interest to people that are doing mortgages, people that are doing titles. the number of applications are sort of limitless. But it takes us out of a world where we're thinking in 40 bytes of op return size. It takes us to a world where we can take gigabytes of information, hash it down, and secure it to the blockchain with one transaction. So I think between the two of them, that'll get you a set of capabilities that will let you build just about anything you want on top of the blockchain in real time, interoperable, and completely peer-to-peer. So, yes, sir.
I have a question about mainstream adoption.
Sure.
Okay, so now we see the technology is being developed for decentralized systems, but how do you, let's say, educate the public to, let's say, accept decentralized systems given the fact that they're so accustomed to centralized systems in the first place?
So the cool thing for me is I often get this question, isn't it too early for 2.0? People are still wrapping their mind around 1.0 and regular Bitcoin. Why do we want to complicate it with this 2.0 stuff? But I actually like to flip that on its head. And I think about the early days of the internet. When did you start caring about the internet? Unless you were a computer science guy, it probably wasn't command line. It was probably when a website that was relevant to your interests showed up on the web. And all of a sudden, the web was interesting. Maybe you were a gold bug or a gold enthusiast, and you didn't care about the web until the first gold website came up. Oh, now I can see the price of gold 24/7, or I can see all these historical charts, or I can get all this news about this topic that interests me, right? So the web was an individual experience. So maybe you don't care about payments or merchants, but hey, you'd love to pay 10% of what you're currently paying Dropbox. And so you end up using the storage system. It doesn't have any of the complexity of the coins. It uses all that in lower levels. And so you just showed up, you stored your files, it was all encrypted, it was an easy-to-use program, and that's how you got your introduction to cryptocurrency. I think 2.0 will actually pull in a vastly different set of demographics as each use case reaches a different population. So Lazus is one of my favorite projects out of Israel. They're doing a decentralized transportation protocol. And so it rewards people for ride sharing, basically a decentralized Uber or Lyft, if you will. People are going to find out about this technology through using that application, right? And they'll just be getting a ride, but they'll be using that technology. So I think that's how it's going to happen is with each of these new use cases, we reach different populations. Okay. That's how we get from here to billions of people. Yeah, Sonny.
Okay. Yes, thanks for that presentation. It was really great. So just how Bitcoin, for example, has disrupted the financial industry, what kind of threats or imminent threats do you see for Bitcoin and blockchain 2.0 technologies? Is it quantum computing? Is it regulation? What keeps you up at night?
It's interesting. I actually think a lot of the threats are actually lower for 2.0. First of all, when I'll take the quantum, or rather the regulation question, a lot of these 2.0 applications don't touch a lot of the most sensitive regulatory areas. So most of the community right now is focused on complying with know your customer standards, anti-money laundering standards, money transmission standards. But what happens when you have a project like Factom where you don't even need a cryptocurrency? The server can touch all the cryptocurrency, and you're just getting database entries. You're just getting information verification. It's almost like a SaaS type of model. And so I think there's a separation that'll happen where people are interacting with these services as opposed to interacting with the currency. And so for large institutions like banks that for regulatory reasons have a lot of trouble dealing in crypto can all of a sudden touch the blockchain and can use the capabilities of the blockchain for auditing or for transparency, for accounting, all these things that have nothing to do with payments. I think that'll actually be pretty advantageous and I'm not seeing a lot of new regulatory territory that will really cover there. When it comes to quantum computing, with quantum computing will probably come quantum encryption. So I'll leave that to the real cryptographers to hash out. But I think technology is always in this race. Eventually they'll break SHA-256 at some point in the future. Right? Might be a very long time, but it'll break and they'll move to 512 or whatever the next generation of that encryption technology is. So
I have one question here. Yeah.
Yep.
Regarding adding data to the blockchain,
Yep.
don't you compromise the anonymity feature of carrying out transactions?
Not necessarily. So I'll let Paul talk about this later during his talk, so I won't spoil too much of it. But the big takeaway is that you can completely maintain privacy when you're adding hashes to a blockchain. Because a hash is just a fingerprint of a document. There's no way you can take that fingerprint and recreate the document. So think of it as a revealed secret. I can have this mortgage document, let's say. I make a hash of it, place it into Factom, gets into the blockchain. Now forever on, I can look at that hash in the blockchain and prove that that document existed at that time and in that place, but I didn't have to show somebody that document. So I can store it privately on my own network or on one of these decentralized networks and then reveal it at a later time when I'm doing an audit or something like that. So there's even a couple cryptographic consensus mechanisms that allow you to reveal it without having to reveal the whole document. So there's a lot of things you can do, but the basic premise is it's still completely private. You're just securing it for verification purposes. Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi, Carl Weir. I'd like to understand the following example where I know documentation has to be used with regards to financial markets. So, real world example, we all know Terra Exchange created a dollar Bitcoin swap.
Sure.
Digital BTC is the client, BlackRock is the dollar counterparty, and BitGo are the custodian. So that derivative is the documentation, and it needs a settlement confirmation from BlackRock, which has to be reported and logged with the CFTC. My interest with Factcom is how would you plug that into that trade? And secondly, you mentioned earlier servers. Where does the service sit? Inside the institution, inside, say, a Bit Reserve, inside digital BTC, or a Terra? I just want to understand the flow.
Sure.
So I can understand where the documents come into it.
So,
and of course, would you need to get permission by ISDA to be able to represent their documentation within that trade?
that's a good question. So I'll let Paul speak to it more specifically during his presentation, and you can certainly corner the man with the bow tie if you have questions about Factom. He's the technical genius behind what they're doing. But at a high level, you would have multiple parties basically agreeing to use this technology as their system of record. So it's a system of record that doesn't have to reside within one party or the other party. Both parties can simply agree to the rules. Here's the rule set that we're going to use. We're going to create our own chain of records, and we're going to let people add records according to that rule set, and then we can come back at any time and use that as our system of record to prove the document was recorded correctly, it was audited correctly, and all of the documents are complete. The cool thing about this is you could actually prove the negative. If you know that there's supposed to be one payment document on the mortgage every month, and it's missing one for March, you know it's missing, and you can prove it's missing because there's no entry that's meeting the rule set during that time. So that's sort of at a high level, but I would definitely corner Paul for the specifics about how you can imagine using that. But he's already been approached by a number of banks, even governments, about title systems. And so I think this will be really useful for creating a third-party, neutral, permanent, and most importantly, immutable, right? Once you put it into the blockchain, nobody can ever change the record. Nobody can ever deny that those records existed. And so I think that'll be really powerful for, we were talking with some of our friends last night about the fact that the government will actually get a lot of benefit out of this, the fact that if you really do believe in auditing and transparency, then you can finally do cryptographic audits. Not once a year, you can do them in real time and know whether people are following particular rule sets. But it's even more interesting for me for business use cases. Yeah.
No, thank you very much. The part two of the question was China, which happens to be extremely document heavy. Have you found any interest coming from the Far East?
I think we're talking with a few partners there. I think it'll be interesting to see how it evolves. I think this will help them because it doesn't have some of the sensitive currency issues, and they can simply look at it as an accounting and a transparency tool. I think in the world in general, they're good actors that people want and generally want transparency and accountability. There are a few bad actors that don't, but I think the good actors will outweigh the bad.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's most of my time, if I'm correct, Bruce. So I'll let you guys go, but thank you for all the questions. I enjoyed it very much.